I never thought I'd find myself back in the workforce at my age, but life has a funny way of steering you down roads you never expected to walk. I had retired a few years ago, thinking I'd live out my days in peace, with just my loyal dog, Max, by my side. But peace doesn't pay the bills, and it certainly doesn't cover the rising cost of veterinary care. Max, a big old German Shepherd mix with a heart of gold, had been my steadfast companion through thick and thin. The thought of him suffering because I couldn't afford his medication gnawed at my insides. It was on one of those restless, cold mornings that I found myself hunched over the kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, flipping through the classifieds out of sheer habit rather than hope. I had already tried every conventional job out there: grocery clerk, security guard, even a stint as a night watchman. But none of them stuck. Either the work was too strenuous for my aging body, or the pay wasn't enough to make a dent in my growing pile of bills. That's when I saw it. A small, inconspicuous ad tucked away in the corner of the page. Grandfather needed for a young boy. Experience in life required. It was an odd request, to say the least. My first thought was that it must be some kind of joke, or worse, a scam. But there was something about it that piqued my curiosity, a sense of fate almost, as if the ad had been written just for me. After staring at the phone number for what felt like an eternity, I finally picked up the receiver and dialed. The voice that answered was soft but firm, the kind of voice that brooks no nonsense. "Isabella speaking," she said. I introduced myself, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, and inquired about the ad. There was a brief pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought she might hang up. But then she sighed, a sound tinged with both exhaustion and hope. "Yes, Mr. Henry, the ad is real," she said, her voice softening. "My son, Ethan, needs someone like you." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. She explained that her son was 9 years old, bright, and full of potential, but he was also confined to a wheelchair due to a trauma he had experienced. Ethan had lost his father before he was born, and his condition had worsened after witnessing his grandmother's sudden death. Isabella's voice wavered as she spoke, revealing just how much this had all taken a toll on her. "I've tried everything, Mr. Henry. Therapists, doctors, specialists. But what Ethan needs isn't more medicine or therapy sessions. He needs someone with life experience, someone who can show him that there's still a world out there worth living for. I hope that person might be you." The sincerity in her voice struck a chord deep within me. I had spent years living a life of routine and solitude, my days defined by the quiet companionship of Max and the isolation of my country home. But hearing Isabella's plea, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose, perhaps, or maybe just a longing to do something meaningful again. "I'll do it," I found myself saying, almost before I had time to think it through. "I don't know how much help I'll be, but I'll do my best." The relief in her voice was palpable. "Thank you, Mr. Henry. Can we meet tomorrow? I'd like to see where you live, where you'll be spending time with Ethan." We arranged for her to visit the next day, and as soon as I hung up, the reality of what I had agreed to hit me like a ton of bricks. What did I know about helping a disabled child? My own daughter, Pamela, was grown and living her own life. I hadn't been a father figure in years, let alone a grandfather. But there was no turning back now. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the house, trying to make it presentable. The place was old and worn, just like me, but it had its charms. The dacha had been my retreat, a place where I could escape the noise of the world, but now it felt like a relic of a life lived long ago. I scrubbed the floors, polished the few pieces of decent furniture I had, and even took Max for an extra long walk to tire him out. The next day, as the sun began to set, I waited anxiously by the window, watching for any sign of a car. When the black SUV finally pulled up, my heart started pounding in my chest. Isabella stepped out, and she was every bit as poised and elegant as I had imagined. A small, sharp-featured woman with an air of quiet authority. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a tailored coat that spoke of money and taste. But what struck me most was the look in her eyes, tired, Yes, but also filled with a determination that bordered on desperation. She was a woman who had been through hell and was still fighting her way out for the sake of her son. Isabella didn't waste any time with pleasantries. After a brief introduction, she insisted on seeing the house. I led her through the small, cluttered rooms, pointing out where Ethan might sleep, where we could spend our days together. She nodded approvingly, though her gaze lingered on the worn furniture and the faded wallpaper, as if she were trying to picture her son in such a humble setting. Finally, we sat down at the kitchen table, and I offered her a cup of tea. She accepted, though she barely touched it. Instead, she looked me square in the eye and said, "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Henry. I need to know who you are, and why you think you can help my son." I told her the truth about my life, my service in the army, my years working at the factory, and how I had ended up here, alone but for Max. I explained that I wasn't anything special, just an old man with a few stories to tell. But I also told her about the bond I had with Max, how much that dog meant to me, and how I couldn't stand the thought of letting him down. I think it was that last part that got to her. Isabella listened intently, her expression softening as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, staring into her teacup as if deep in thought. Then she looked up at me and said, "I think you'll do just fine, Mr. Henry. Ethan needs someone real, someone who's lived a life, not just another therapist with a degree on the wall. I want you to start tomorrow." The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming, but with it came a wave of apprehension. Could I really do this? Was I really the right person to help this boy? But as I'd walked her back to her car, I caught a glimpse of Max, wagging his tail and looking up at me with those big, trusting eyes. And in that moment, I knew I had to try. For Max, for Ethan, and maybe even for myself. Isabella shook my hand before getting into the car. "I'll send the driver to pick you up at 9 a.m. I'll see you then." As the car drove away, I stood there in the fading light, a strange mix of excitement and dread churning in my stomach. Tomorrow, my life was going to change, whether I was ready for it or not. I looked down at Max, who had settled back on the porch, watching the world with his usual calm demeanor. "Looks like we've got a job to do, old boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. Max thumped his tail in agreement, and together we walked back inside to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The first few days with Ethan were tentative, like stepping onto a frozen lake where one wrong move could send us both plunging into icy depths. I arrived at Isabella's grand house each morning, my old boots clicking on the polished marble floors, feeling as out of place as a stray dog in a palace. But there was something about Ethan that drew me in, something that made me want to crack open the walls he built around himself. Ethan was quiet, almost unnervingly so, when I first met him. His wheelchair seemed more like a cage than a convenience, and his eyes, though bright, were shadowed with a sadness I recognized all too well. He was polite, but distant, answering my questions with as few words as possible. I could tell he wasn't used to trusting people, and who could blame him? Life had dealt him a cruel hand, and he was still reeling from the blow. I figured if I was going to reach him, I'd have to do it on his terms, slowly and carefully, like coaxing a frightened animal out of hiding. I started with small talk, weather, school, his favorite books. But it was like trying to chip away at a mountain with a spoon, so I decided to take a different approach. "Do you like stories, Ethan?" I asked one afternoon as we sat in the sunroom, the golden light spilling through the large windows, warming the room and casting long shadows. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "I guess." "Good," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "Because I've got plenty of them. Some are funny, some are sad, and some are downright unbelievable. But they're all true, or at least mostly true." That caught his attention. He glanced up at me, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Like what?" I smiled, sensing the opening I'd been waiting for. "Well, let me tell you about the time Max and I got lost in the woods during a snowstorm. It was back when I was younger, and a bit more foolish. I launched into the story, painting a vivid picture of a younger, more reckless version of myself, setting out on a hiking trip with Max in the dead of winter. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning the familiar woods into a white, howling wilderness. We'd wandered for hours, the cold seeping into our bones, until finally, just when I thought we might not make it, Max had found a small cave to shelter in. We spent the night there, huddled together for warmth, with nothing but the sound of the wind howling outside. Ethan listened intently, his eyes wide as I described the fear I'd felt, the desperation of those hours spent lost and alone. But I also told him about the relief that had flooded through me when we finally found our way back, and how that experience had deepened the bond between Max and me. By the time I finished, Ethan was leaning forward in his chair, completely engrossed in the tale. There was a spark in his eyes, a light that hadn't been there before. "Did you ever get lost again?" he asked, his voice filled with the kind of excitement only a child could muster. I chuckled. "Not like that. But there was this one time during my military service, when I was stationed near the border. Max was with me then too. We were on patrol when we came across some poachers. It wasn't exactly getting lost, but we sure as hell didn't know where we were going to end up. I could see I had him hooked, so I dove into the story, telling him about the tense standoff with the poachers, the cold sweat that had trickled down my back as we tried to outmaneuver them in the dense forest. It was the kind of tale that might have sounded like a campfire story to anyone else, but to Ethan, it was pure adventure. As I spoke, I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was imagining himself there with me, facing down danger, feeling the thrill of the chase. For the first time since we'd met, I saw him smile, a real genuine smile that lit up his face and made him look like any other boy his age, not a child burdened by tragedy. Over the days that followed, our conversations became longer, the silences less frequent. Each day, I'd bring a new story to share, and each day, Ethan would ask more questions, probing deeper into the details, wanting to know everything. He was particularly fascinated by my time in the Army, the discipline, the camaraderie, and most of all, the dogs we trained. I told him about the border patrols, the grueling training sessions, and the bond between a soldier and his canine partner. He was captivated by the idea that a dog could be more than just a pet, that they could be heroes too. One afternoon, after I'd finished telling him about a particularly close call during a mission, Ethan surprised me by asking, "Do you think Max could do that? You know, be a hero like those dogs you trained." I looked at Max, who was sprawled out on the rug, half asleep, his ears twitching at the sound of his name. "Max is already a hero, Ethan. He's been with me through thick and thin. Dogs don't have to wear medals or perform daring rescues to be heroes. They just need to be there when you need them most." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing my words. "I wish I could have a dog like Max," he said softly. That was the moment I knew I was making progress. He wasn't just listening to my stories. He was connecting with them, finding solace and inspiration in them. And in doing so, he was beginning to let me in, to trust me. But there was still so much more to uncover. I could see the shadows in his eyes, the ghosts of his past that haunted him. And I knew that breaking through those barriers would take time. But I was patient, and so was Max. Together, we would chip away at the walls Ethan had built around himself, one story at a time. The more time I spent with Ethan, the more I realized that he wasn't just a boy who needed a friend. He was a boy who needed hope. And maybe, just maybe, I could give him that. I had lived through my own share of dark times, and I had learned that sometimes the smallest spark of hope could be enough to light up even the darkest night. As our sessions continued, I began to share not just the triumphs of my past, but also the struggles, the times I had failed, the moments of doubt and fear that had shaped me. I told him about losing my wife, about the loneliness that had settled over me like a thick fog after she was gone, and how Max had been my only source of comfort during those bleak days. Ethan listened in silence, his expression unreadable, but I could see the impact my words were having. He was beginning to understand that life wasn't just about the victories, but about how you faced the defeats as well. And slowly he started to open up to me, sharing fragments of his own story, his fears, his frustrations, and the overwhelming sense of loss that had paralyzed him, both physically and emotionally. One day, as we sat in the sunroom, watching the light fade into twilight, Ethan turned to me and asked, "Do you think I'll ever be able to walk again, Mr. Henry?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and fragile hopes. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I think that's up to you, Ethan. You've been through more than most people could ever imagine, and it's left scars, inside and out. But scars heal, and so can you. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if you want it, if you really want it, then I believe you can do it. He looked down at his hands, his fingers curling around the armrests of his wheelchair. What if I'm too scared to try? I reached out and gently placed my hand over his. Then that's okay. It's okay to be scared, but you don't have to do it alone. I'll be here, and so will Max. We'll be with you every step of the way. Ethan nodded, his jaw set in determination, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of resolve in his eyes. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless, and in that moment, I knew we were on the right path. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, our bond grew stronger. Ethan became more confident, more willing to push himself, and I found myself looking forward to our time together more than I ever could have imagined. He was no longer just a boy I was hired to help. He was becoming like a grandson to me, and I was determined to do everything I could to help him find his way back to the life he deserved. And in return, Ethan was giving me something I hadn't realized I was missing. A sense of purpose, a reason to get up each morning and face the day with hope. He was teaching me that even in the darkest of times, there was always a way forward, always a reason to keep fighting. We still had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were heading in the right direction. And as I looked at Ethan, his face lit by the fading light of the setting sun, I knew that together we could overcome anything. The idea of bringing Ethan out to my old dacha came to me on one of those quiet afternoons when the sun seemed to hang lazily in the sky, casting a golden hue over everything. We had been talking about nature, about the forests I used to roam with Max when I was younger, and I saw a spark of interest in Ethan's eyes that I hadn't seen before. It was then that I realized how much he needed a change of scenery, a break from the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of his home and the weight of his memories. I brought up the idea to Isabella during one of our weekly check-ins. Her usual composed demeanor faltered for a moment, and I could see the worry etched into her face. I understood her concern. After all, Ethan had been through so much already, but I also knew that the stagnant routine of his life was doing him no favors. Isabella, I said gently, I think Ethan needs this. He's making progress, yes, but he needs to see that there's more to life than just the walls of your home and the boundaries of his wheelchair. My dacha is quiet, peaceful, a place where he can just be a boy again, even if only for a little while. She hesitated, chewing on her lip in a rare display of uncertainty. Finally, she sighed and nodded. You're right, Mr. Henry. I can see how much he's changed since you've been spending time with him. If you think this will help, then I'll trust your judgment. But please, be careful with him. I will, I promised, feeling the weight of her trust settle on my shoulders. I'll treat him like my own. The following weekend, a crisp autumn morning, we set off for the dacha. Ethan was excited, though he tried to hide it, and Max, ever the perceptive one, seemed to sense the importance of the trip, wagging his tail as we drove out of the city. The journey itself was uneventful, the car winding through the countryside, leaving behind the noise and bustle of the city for the serene embrace of nature. When we arrived at the dacha, Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. My home wasn't much, a small rustic cabin nestled among tall, ancient trees with a river nearby that shimmered in the sunlight. But to Ethan, it must have seemed like another world entirely. The air was fresh and cool, filled with the scent of pine and earth, a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell of the house he'd been confined to for so long. This is it, I said, stepping out of the car and breathing in deeply. It's not much, but it's home. Ethan smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made him look younger, more carefree. It's perfect, he said softly, as Max bounded out of the car, barking happily as he dashed off to explore his familiar territory. I showed Ethan around, pointing out the small vegetable garden I tended, the old oak tree where I'd hum a tire swing ages ago, and the little dock by the river where Max and I would sometimes sit and watch the water flow by. To my surprise, Ethan wanted to try everything. The wheelchair was left at the door as we took slow, careful steps together, Ethan leaning on me for support, but determined to experience as much as he could. The weekend passed in a blur of activity. We spent our days outside, soaking up the last of the autumn sunshine. Ethan was fascinated by the simplest things. The way the leaves crunched underfoot, the sound of birds singing in the trees, the feeling of the cool breeze on his face. I showed him how to cast a fishing line into the river, though we didn't catch much besides a few curious minnows. He laughed when Max jumped into the water, shaking himself off and spraying us both with droplets. On Saturday evening, I built a fire in the old stone fireplace, and we sat around it, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. I cooked us a simple dinner, stew and bread, and we ate together, the warmth of the fire seeping into our bones. Ethan was quieter than usual, his eyes reflecting the flickering light as he stared into the flames. "Do you ever get lonely out here, Mr. Henry?" he asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I considered his question for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but there's a kind of peace in the solitude. It gives you time to think, to remember. And with Max around, I'm never truly alone." Ethan nodded, absorbing my words. "I like it here. It feels safe." "It is," I said, "and you're welcome here anytime, Ethan. This place can be your retreat whenever you need it." He smiled at that, a soft, contented smile, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing the real Ethan, the boy hidden beneath the layers of pain and fear. Sunday morning came all too quickly, and with it, a sense of impending finality. As we prepared to leave, Ethan asked if we could take one last walk before heading back. I agreed, and we set out, Ethan moving slowly but steadily beside me, with Max trotting ahead, leading the way. We walked down to the river, where the water flowed calmly, reflecting the clear sky above. Ethan stopped at the edge of the dock, looking out over the water. "I used to dream about places like this," he said quietly. "When I was in the hospital, I'd close my eyes and imagine I was somewhere far away, somewhere peaceful. I never thought I'd actually get to be in a place like this." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply stood beside him, letting the silence speak for itself. The world felt so still in that moment, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. And then, just as we were about to turn back, something happened that I'll never forget. Max, always the playful one, suddenly barked and ran off into the woods, disappearing into the underbrush. A moment later, we heard a high-pitched yelp, followed by the sound of something crashing through the trees. "Max!" Ethan shouted, panic-lacing his voice. Without thinking, he took a step forward, his body moving instinctively, as if the fear for his beloved companion had overridden all else. And then another step, and another. It wasn't until he had taken a dozen steps, almost reaching the tree line, that he realized what he was doing. He stopped, turning to look at me, his eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Henry, I'm walking," he whispered, disbelief coloring his voice. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched Ethan take a few more shaky steps, each one a miracle in itself. He stumbled slightly, and I rushed to his side, ready to catch him, but he steadied himself, refusing to let go of the moment. "Max!" he called again, his voice stronger now, as he took another step forward. And then Max appeared, limping slightly but otherwise unharmed, his tail wagging furiously as he bounded back towards us. Ethan fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around Max, burying his face in the dog's fur. I could see the tears streaming down his cheeks, but they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of triumph. I knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Ethan," I said, my own voice choked with emotion. "You walked." He looked up at me, his face a mixture of joy and astonishment. I did, didn't I?" "Yes, you did. And you're going to keep walking, one step at a time. You're stronger than you know, Ethan." We sat there for a while, the three of us, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, the river flowing gently beside us. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a moment that I knew would stay with me for the rest of my life. When we finally returned to the house, Ethan was exhausted, but there was a new light in his eyes, a fire that hadn't been there before. He'd had taken his first steps back to life, and there was no going back now. As we drove back to the city that evening, the car filled with a comfortable silence, I glanced over at Ethan. He was leaning against the window, his eyes half closed, a small smile playing on his lips. Max was curled up beside him, content and calm. I knew that this weekend had been a turning point, not just for Ethan, but for me as well. I had found something here, something I hadn't even realized I was searching for. And as we pulled up to Isabella's house, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a sense that we were all heading in the right direction. Isabella was waiting for us at the door, her face a mixture of concern and hope. As she helped Ethan out of the car, she shot me a questioning look, and I simply nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "He's walking, Isabella," I said softly. "Your boy is walking." The look of pure, unadulterated joy that spread across her face was something I would treasure forever. She pulled Ethan into a tight embrace, her tears falling freely, and I quietly stepped back, giving them their moment. As I stood there, watching mother and son reunite, I realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome, but for the first time, I felt truly hopeful. We were a team now, Ethan, Isabella, Max, and me, and together, there was nothing we couldn't face. And so, as I drove back to the dacha that night, the sky darkening above me, I allowed myself to believe that the best was yet to come. The weekend retreat had been more than just a break from routine. It had been the start of something new, something wonderful. I didn't know where the road would lead us, but I knew one thing for certain: we were heading there together, and that made all the difference. The autumn days at the dacha had passed in a peaceful rhythm, each one a step closer to something resembling normalcy for Ethan. His progress had been remarkable, each weekend bringing new milestones, each day at the dacha strengthening the bond between us. It felt as though we had finally found a groove, a routine that offered Ethan the freedom he so desperately needed and the stability he craved. But life, as I had learned many times over, has a way of shaking things up just when you think you've found solid ground. It started like any other Saturday. The air was crisp with the first bite of winter, the leaves crunching underfoot as we took our morning walk through the woods. Ethan was in high spirits, his steps more confident than ever, while Max, always our faithful companion, bounded ahead, sniffing out trails and chasing after invisible prey. We had settled into a comfortable silence as we walked, the kind that comes with trust and familiarity. The sun was just beginning to dip in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, when I felt it, a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest. It was so sudden, so intense, that I had to stop in my tracks, my hand instinctively clutching at my shirt. "Mr. Henry?" Ethan's voice was full of concern as he noticed me lagging behind. He turned back, his face creased with worry. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile, trying to wave off his concern. "I'm fine, Ethan. Just a little tired, that's all. Let's head back to the house." But even as I said the words, the pain intensified, radiating down my left arm and making it difficult to breathe. I could feel the cold sweat breaking out on my forehead, my vision starting to blur around the edges. This was no ordinary fatigue. This was something far more serious. We made it back to the dacha, though I could barely remember the walk. My focus was solely on keeping myself upright, on not alarming Ethan more than necessary. By the time we reached the front porch, I knew I couldn't hide it anymore. I stumbled as I reached for the door, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. "Mr. Henry, what's wrong?" Ethan's voice was trembling now, panic creeping into his words. I need to lie down," I managed to say, my breath coming in short, labored gasps. "Ethan, listen to me. Go inside, grab the phone, and call your mother. Tell her to come quickly." Ethan's face went pale, but he nodded, his usual confidence wavering as the gravity of the situation hit him. He rushed inside, leaving me to lean heavily against the doorframe, the world spinning around me. Max was at my side in an instant, his worried eyes locked on mine as if he understood what was happening. I managed to make it to the couch, collapsing onto it as the pain in my chest tightened like a vice. My thoughts were a chaotic jumble, racing from the fear of what was happening to the desperate hope that Ethan could get help in time. I had faced death before, in the army, in the years after, but this was different. This time, I wasn't ready to go. Not now, not when Ethan needed me more than ever. I heard Ethan's voice in the next room, shaky but determined as he spoke to his mother. The sound of it brought a small measure of comfort, knowing that he was taking charge, that he was doing everything he could. But the pain was relentless, and I felt myself slipping, my vision dimming as the edges of consciousness began to blur. And then, just as I thought I might lose the battle, I heard Ethan call my name. Mr. Henry, please, don't leave me. His voice was a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink. I forced my eyes open, struggling to focus on him as he hurried back into the room, the phone still clutched in his hand. There was fear in his eyes, a raw, desperate fear that cut through my own pain like a knife. I'm here, Ethan, I whispered, though my voice was barely more than a rasp. I'm not going anywhere. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I could keep that promise. The pain was overwhelming, a crushing force that threatened to drag me under. I could feel my strength waning, the world slipping further out of reach. And then, in a moment that would forever be etched into my memory, Ethan did something I never could have expected. He dropped the phone, and with a look of pure determination, stood up from his chair. His legs were trembling, his face twisted with effort, but he pushed forward, step by agonizing step, until he was beside me. Mr. Henry, he said, his voice breaking as he knelt down beside the couch, his hands reaching out to steady me. You can't leave me. Not now. Please. There was a fierceness in his eyes that took my breath away, an intensity that I had only seen glimpses of before. And then, in a voice that was both pleading and commanding, he said the words that would change everything. You told me I was strong, that I could do anything if I wanted it enough. Well, I need you to be strong now. Please, please stay with me. It was those words, more than anything else, that kept me tethered to life. I couldn't give up, not when Ethan was fighting so hard to keep me here. I felt a surge of energy, a desperate will to survive, coursing through me. I reached out, my hand finding his, and I squeezed it with all the strength I could muster. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan, I whispered, though the effort left me gasping. We're in this together, remember? Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face, but there was a determination in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. He sat beside me, holding my hand as the minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. I could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching, a sound that brought a sliver of hope. Isabella had clearly wasted no time, and for that, I was eternally grateful. But it was Ethan who had truly saved me. His strength, his courage, his refusal to let me go. It was all that had kept me from slipping into the darkness. As the paramedics burst through the door, their faces a blur of movement and efficiency, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I was lifted onto a stretcher, the pain still gnawing at my chest, but it was secondary now, pushed aside by the overwhelming relief of knowing I had made it through. Ethan was by my side the whole time, refusing to leave even as they loaded me into the ambulance. I could see the fear in his eyes, but also the strength that had brought him to his feet, that had driven him to walk when all hope seemed lost. Ethan, I murmured as the paramedics prepared to close the doors. You're going to be okay. We're both going to be okay. He nodded, his grip tightening on my hand, and I knew in that moment that he believed it too. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices. I was barely aware of the chaos around me, my focus solely on the boy who had saved my life. Ethan rode with me, his hand never leaving mine, his presence a constant source of strength as I fought to stay conscious. By the time we reached the hospital, the pain had dulled to a throbbing ache, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. I was whisked away into the emergency room, the stereo lights blinding as I was bombarded with questions, prodded and poked by an army of doctors and nurses. But through it all, I held on to one thought. Ethan had walked. In the face of fear and desperation, he had found the strength to stand, to fight, to save me. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, a victory that would change everything for both of us. Hours later, as I lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed in the background, I finally allowed myself to relax. The worst was over. The doctors had assured me that I would recover, that the heart attack, because that's what it was, had been caught in time. I would need to take it easy, to make some lifestyle changes, but I would live. Isabella was there, her face pale, but her eyes filled with relief as she sat by my bedside. She had been told everything, and I could see the gratitude in her gaze as she reached out to squeeze my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being there for my son." I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. It was Ethan who had been there for me, not the other way around. But I understood what she meant. We had saved each other that day, and in doing so, we had forged a bond that could never be broken. Ethan was allowed in a few minutes later, his face a mixture of exhaustion and joy. He rushed to my side, his steps more confident than I had ever seen before, and I knew that the events of that day had changed him in ways we were only beginning to understand. "Mr. Henry," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I walked. I really walked." "You did, Ethan," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. "And you saved me. You're stronger than you ever knew." He smiled, a smile that lit up the entire room, and I felt my heart swell with pride. This boy, who had once been so lost, so broken, had found his way back to life, and in doing so, he had given me back my own. As I drifted off to sleep that night, the steady beep of the heart monitor in the background, I allowed myself to believe that we were both heading towards a brighter future. The road ahead would be challenging, no doubt, but we would face it together. Ethan, Isabella, Max, and me. And together, there was nothing we couldn't overcome. The days following my stay in the hospital were a whirlwind of recovery and reflection. The doctors had insisted that I take it easy, avoid stress, and adhere to a strict regimen of medication and light exercise. I was told in no uncertain terms that my life needed to slow down, something easier said than done when you have a boy like Ethan depending on you. Isabella, ever the concerned mother, had made arrangements for me to stay in a rehabilitation facility, where I could be monitored around the clock, but the thought of being cooped up in another sterile environment, surrounded by strangers, was unbearable. I had spent too much of my life alone. I wasn't about to spend my recovery that way too. It was Ethan who came up with the idea that changed everything. "Mr. Henry," he said one afternoon as we sat in the sunroom of Isabella's house, the sunlight streaming through the windows and casting a warm glow over the room. I had been released from the hospital the day before, and although I was still weak, I was determined to get back on my feet as quickly as possible. "Why don't you recover at the dacha?" I looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. "The dacha?" He nodded, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "It's peaceful there, quiet. You could rest, and I could help take care of you. We could spend time together like we did before. And Max would be there too." Isabella, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "That's not a bad idea, Ethan," she said slowly. "The fresh air, the tranquility. It might be just what Mr. Henry needs to recover. And I know how much the dacha means to both of you." I hesitated, the idea appealing but also daunting. The dacha had always been my sanctuary, a place of solitude and reflection. But the thought of returning there, this time with Ethan by my side, was strangely comforting. I could already picture the two of us sitting on the porch, Max at our feet, the weight of the world lifting off our shoulders. "Are you sure, Ethan?" I asked, searching his eyes for any hint of doubt. He nodded again, more firmly this time. "I want to. And I think it'll help both of us." It didn't take long to convince me. A week later, after Isabella had arranged for a nurse to visit daily and made sure the dacha was stocked with everything we could possibly need, we set off. The drive felt different this time, less a journey into the unknown, and more a return to a place where we had already started to heal. As we pulled up the gravel driveway, the dacha came into view, its wooden beams and sloping roof bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Max, who had been riding in the back seat with his head out the window, barked excitedly, clearly recognizing that he was home. "This is it," I said softly as we stepped out of the car, breathing in the crisp, clean air. Home sweet home. Ethan smiled, a wide, genuine smile that made him look like a different boy from the one I had first met. There was a lightness in his step as he walked beside me up the path, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture that was both supportive and reassuring. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet, contented routine. Mornings were spent on the porch, sipping tea and listening to the birds sing, while Max lazed in the sun. Afternoons were for light walks through the woods, with Ethan guiding me along the familiar paths, his presence a constant reminder of how far we had both come. But it wasn't just the peaceful surroundings that helped me recover. It was the sense of purpose that came with having Ethan there. Each day, he grew stronger, more confident in his ability to walk, to move through the world without fear. We set small goals for ourselves, walking a little further each day, climbing the steps to the porch without holding onto the railing, even spending an afternoon fishing by the river, our rods resting against the dock as we talked about everything and nothing. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that Ethan brought up a subject I hadn't expected him to broach. "Mr. Henry," he began, his tone serious. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the future." I looked at him, curious. "What about it?" He hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "I want to go back to school. I know it won't be easy, and there'll be a lot of catching up to do, but I'm ready. I want to try." The confession took me by surprise. School had been a sore subject for Ethan ever since the accident, something he had avoided talking about, let alone considering. But here he was, looking at me with those determined eyes, ready to face a challenge that had once seemed insurmountable. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Ethan," I said, my heart swelling with pride. "You're stronger than you know, and I have no doubt you'll do great." He smiled, though there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "Do you really think so? What if I can't keep up?" "Ethan," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you've already overcome more than most people ever will. You've learned to walk again, to face your fears. School is just another step on that journey. And you won't be doing it alone. You have your mom, Max, and me right here beside you." He nodded, his smile growing as the last of his doubts seemed to melt away. "Thank you, Mr. Henry, for everything." The days stretched into weeks, each one a testament to our new beginning. Ethan enrolled in a local school, a small, supportive institution that welcomed him with open arms. I could see the nerves eating away at him on the first day, the way his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his backpack, but I also saw the determination in his eyes. The same determination that had gotten him through his darkest days. "I'll be fine, Mr. Henry," he said as he climbed out of the car, Max watching from the back seat with a whine of concern. "I'll be just fine." And he was. Each day he returned home with a new story, a new friend made, a new lesson learned. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, but he pushed through them all, the way I knew he would. As for me, the dacha became not just a place of recovery, but a true home. Isabella visited often, bringing groceries, books, and an endless supply of concern. We talked about the future, about what would happen when I was fully recovered, but the more time passed, the less urgent those discussions became. There was no rush to move on, no need to return to the city just yet. Here, at the dacha, we had everything we needed. But the peace of our new life wasn't meant to last forever. One chilly November evening, as we sat around the fire, Max curled up at our feet, Isabella arrived with news that shook the calm we had so carefully built. "Henry," she said, her voice tight with emotion as she stepped inside, shaking the cold from her coat. "There's something I need to tell you." I felt a knot of anxiety twist in my gut as I watched her take a deep breath, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "What is it, Isabella?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated for just a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "I've been contacted by someone from Ethan's past, someone who claims to know what really happened the day of the accident." The room seemed to freeze, the crackling of the fire suddenly too loud, too intrusive. I looked at Ethan, who had gone pale, his eyes wide with shock and fear. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. Isabella moved closer, taking a seat beside us. "It's complicated, and I don't have all the details yet, but there's a man, a private investigator, who's been looking into the events surrounding your grandmother's death. He believes there may have been foul play involved, something that could explain why you've blocked out the memories of that day." The words hit us like a sledgehammer, shattering the fragile peace we had worked so hard to create. For a moment, no one spoke, the weight of the revelation too heavy to process. Foul play? I finally managed to ask, my voice thick with disbelief. "Isabella, what are you saying? That someone intentionally caused the accident?" She shook her head, frustration and sadness etched into her features. "I don't know, Henry. But this investigator seems convinced that there's more to the story than we've been told. He wants to meet with us, to share what he's found, and to see if there's anything Ethan might remember that could help piece it all together." Ethan was shaking his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't remember anything, Mom. I've tried, but it's all a blur. I don't want to go back there. I don't want to think about it." I reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But maybe understanding what happened could help you move forward. Sometimes the only way to find peace is to face the past, no matter how painful it might be." He looked at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but also with a trust that I knew I couldn't betray. "Do you really think it could help, Mr. Henry?" "I think it's worth considering," I said softly. "You've come so far, Ethan, and whatever happened that day, it doesn't define you. But if there are answers out there, it might be time to find them." Isabella nodded, her expression somber. "We don't have to decide anything tonight, but I wanted you both to know, so we can face this together, like we always have." That night, after Isabella had left and Ethan had gone to bed, I sat by the fire, staring into the dying embers as the reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. The peaceful life we had carved out for ourselves at the dacho was about to be tested in ways we hadn't anticipated. The ghosts of Ethan's past, once thought to be buried, were rising to the surface, demanding to be faced. But this time, we wouldn't face them alone. Whatever dark truths awaited us, whatever painful memories were unearthed, we would confront them together. Isabella, Ethan, Max, and me. As I finally climbed into bed that night, the weight of the impending confrontation pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something monumental, something that could either shatter us or make us stronger than ever. And in the quiet darkness, as Max curled up beside me, I made a silent vow. No matter what came our way, I would protect Ethan, just as he had protected me. We had already fought our way through one storm, and now, as a new storm gathered on the horizon, I knew we would face it head-on, together. This was our new beginning, a beginning that, though fraught with uncertainty, held the promise of a future forged not in fear, but in courage, trust, and the unbreakable bonds of family.